point from, what you did with the American literature course, but we've been looking at myths as well, because when you think about it, literature gives us the myths of our society. Frankenstein, Don Juan, Dracula, just to use a French or a British context. How did um, um, how did literature become specifically British? Where was it born? How did it evolve to become specifically British? How is it adapted to the change in our conception of ourselves? And I would like to insist on the fact that literature is a reflection on the state we're in. And we're going to take examples that show this very clearly. So, when we go through history, we'll be looking at the way that literature is, first of all, for example, very much concerned with religion and religious matters, because, it was a time in history, starting from the Middle Ages, when our relationship, humanity's relationship to God was really important. So our relationship to God. But then we'll be looking at our definition of our understanding of the monarchy, our definition of gender roles, our concepts such as patriotism, love, our interaction with nature, war, treason, crime, all those things. A plurality of discourses that is presented in literature, and they're discourses about us and about our environment, our physical, geographical, historical, moral, ethical environment. And in the period that we're experiencing nowadays, with things that are happening in the world, we really need some guidelines, some ideas about our relationship in particular to the world and to our ethical considerations. If I just take the example of the definition of gender and gender roles, you'll see that literature is going to follow and sometimes um, um, be be a precursor in the sense of how we define ourselves. How we've been defining ourselves as far as our gender is concerned has changed tremendously over the centuries. From the definition of the role of women in the Middle Ages up to the 19th century, to the definition of gender roles in the 20th century, how it has evolved, and now 21st century, late 20th century, with all the questions around, transgender issues, LGBT, the way that people define themselves as, neither of one sex or the other, and this is something that is tremendously resonant in the literature that we're experiencing at the moment. So it's very important to see what the connections are. And I'm not saying, that literature expresses the real, but there is a kind of connection. It moves ahead of us, of our societies, and at the same time, it reflects us. So please, we'll be looking at various periods. Please read the text that I'm going to give you on the Amethyst page carefully. I'm just giving you, by way of introduction, a few examples of what I mean by the connection between history and our sense of ourselves and our great fundamental myths which enable us to express who we are, our identity. And I'm going to take some of my examples, not all of my examples, but some of my examples from Scotland, which is, if you don't know, the subject that I'm specializing in. Scotland, the country of, gave you this picture, the country of what they call har, which is another word for fog, which exists only in Scotland. The origin of Scotland is in this kind of environment, har and darkness, and the origin of Scottish literature is in storytelling and song. There's something that pertains to orality in the beginning of literature. And the first traces of Scottish literature, which is something that I don't expect you to remember, it's just an illustration of my point. But the first traces of Scottish literature taking place up there in Scotland is in Welsh. In Welsh, Wales, in the Carnarvon, and I'm not even writing this down for you, just using this as an example. They're fragments of stories of soldiers going to war, and Uh, Darkness is also very important. The ballads, is very important. The Scottish ballad is the origin of Scottish literature, and they're still known and used in Scotland nowadays. They've been turned into songs by the great poet Robert Burns and other people. But Robert Burns is the one who stands out, the one who's really famous. And nowadays they're still sung. I heard one on the radio only yesterday, being sung. Um, and it's still there. The sense of darkness is still there, in particular in the kind of fiction that the kind of crime fiction. Can you see everything on screen? Because it's hard for me to see everything with the chat and everything. Can you see my
Yes, we
can you
can
see
see.
my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, fine, thank you. All right. I gave you three examples here of how literature in Scotland is still, in fact, still belongs to the kind of thing that happens with the Scottish ballad. Three writers, contemporary writers, crime writers. At the top, on the top left-hand corner there, Louise Welsh, then Denise Miner and Ian Rankin. All three of them are very famous crime writers, and they have evolved this notion, this way of describing crime fiction in Scotland, which is called tartan noir. Tartan is the I can't even what defines Scotland, Scottish myth. Tartan noir. So the noir novel, the crime novel, is very much influenced by what happens at the very origin of literature. And in another example for you of how this has pertained, and again another example in Scottish literature, and then I promise I'll talk to you about other things. But in the Scottish lowlands, there's a very important period, the period of the War of Independence. What I wrote in red there on the slide, the period of the War of Independence, because you know that in 1706 uh, Scotland and was always, ever since the Middle Ages, Scotland was at war with England. So the Wars of Independence is also called the Anglo-Scottish Wars, which were a series of military conflicts between the kingdoms of England and this of Scotland in the late 13th and 14th century. And the English king, King Edward, fought against two very emblematic figures of Scottish history, King Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. And it gave birth, those historical events gave birth to a great poetic tradition in Scotland. Poetic, not in the sense of, Alexandrine or, what you imagine in French context, or romantic poetry in an English context, but again, the ballad, narrative poems which tell you about the events of the war. And I wrote something here. So this is the statue of King Robert the Bruce, which you find in one of the two pillars at the big front gate of the Edinburgh Castle. So you've got the statue of Robert the Bruce, and on the other side you've got the statue of William Wallace. And John Barber, who was a poet in the Middle Ages, wrote the story of those wars in a long narrative poem, which is entitled "The Bruce." In the 1370s. And from this, there are lines from this poem that are still used nowadays. And if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, this is a picture of one of the stones in the new it's been going on for 20 years now, but in the Parliament House in Edinburgh. And there's a certain number of inscriptions on the wall, and this is one of them. It's an extract, a very, very famous verse from Barber's Bruce, and it's entitled. The verse goes, "Free, freedom is a noble thing," and this captures the essence of the Scots, of Scottish identity. This idea of freedom, of this hankering after freedom, which still finds its way in later context. For example, the Second World War, we have this verse from Barbara, which came up again for obvious reasons, but also into contemporary literature. And I gave you the example here on the top left hand corner of a novel by a contemporary writer, James Robertson, who wrote about slavery in sugar plantations in the 18th century. And this is the novel. It's entitled Joseph Knight, and it was published in 2004. And in there, the concern, the importance of freedom is very much underlined. William Wallace, I'm sure that you've seen or you've heard of the movie Braveheart. Braveheart, William Wallace, here played by the unforgettable Mel Gibson. Australian, when you think about it, a retelling of the story of William Wallace. Again, he belongs to the founding mythology of Scotland. He's a cult figure nowadays, William Wallace. And the reason why I wanted to show you those pictures was that, again, a poem called by somebody called Blind Harry, entitled The Wallace, captures again the wars of independence from Wallace's point of view, and it was the beginning of a cult, an actual cult. You've heard of Frankenstein, you've heard of Dracula. Now, William Wallace is one such mythical cult figures in Scottish history and in Scottish literature. This poem that I'm telling you about, whose title I don't need you to remember, but still, I need you to remember the fact that, in the 18th century, the retelling of the wars of independence was still being printed and reprinted. It was the most popular, most read text in Scotland. It was there in every household. And of course, it has come down to us in the shape of souvenirs that you found in souvenir shops, little statues, what do they call them? Figurines, or even horrible dolls. But it tells you how important that is. More recently, and to change the context, just still talking about why there's this interconnection between literature and the world. 9/11. So, I'm skipping over centuries and centuries from, what happened in the Middle Ages, how literature was born in the Middle Ages in Scotland with the ballad that is still popular today, which tells the story of those figures that have become myths that represent who we are as a people. And I'm talking about the Scots here. Now, jumping ahead to 9/11, a period that you can't remember because you're too young, but I can remember, something that happened in my lifetime. I know where I was when the planes hit the towers. Well, this sparkled a series of novels, films, series, which were all dealt with this post-apocalyptic theme. And I just gave you one example, but there's loads and loads of them that I'm sure that you know. And if you watch series, I'm sure that you've got at least one example of post-apocalyptic series. I've got what I've got for you here is the novel by American writer The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Um, um, but there's also Don DeLillo, the American writer Don DeLillo, whom you might have heard of last semester. Falling Man is about 9/11. Paul Auster, very important American writer, wrote about 9/11 in the novel Man in the Dark. And as I said, TV series, post-apocalyptic series, post-apocalyptic novels. So, those are examples of how we connect, how literature is an important mirror into the state of the world. And art, of course. Okay, my last, no, and then I'm going to talk. So, the Second World War, if you look at history and you look at the history of trauma, there's always going to be a host of novels and writing about those periods. And here's another example: the Second World War, the Holocaust, the H bomb, which were very traumatic and important historical events, sparkled the very famous painting by Picasso, Guernica, but also in fiction. Uh, uh, gave you two examples by British writers. Of course, the very, very famous 1984 by George Orwell. Don't have to say anything about it because you know about this book and you know how it connects with, the kind of with Stalinism and Nazism and how it depicts totalitarianism at work and what it does to the humans. So there's something about the philosophy, the philosophical implications, the the implications to our integrity as human beings, is as important as this. I just want to say a few words on about this other novel, Kate Atkinson. Sorry, because I told you I was going to look at the chat, and I'm okay. Kate Atkinson, yes, yes, that's right, Claudia. Absolutely, Kate Atkinson, very important. And of course, you've got a lot nowadays. There's a lot of writers writing historical fictions has become very important, very famous. So nowadays, Atkinson is a case in point. But you've got other people writing about Robertson, as I said, people writing about periods in history that have become mythical to us. Yes, absolutely. Martin Amis, do you know Martin Amis at all, or is this the first time you've heard this name? Have you heard the name before? He's a contemporary writer, still alive? Never? Okay, so just a few words. Martin Amis, contemporary writer, still alive. The son, you've read some reviews, okay. The son of somebody called Kingsley Amis, who was a very famous writer in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and who was the one of the proponents of, when realistic fiction became very important before the Second World War, the return to realism. Realistic fiction was very, very important, and Kingsley Amis was one of those writers of realistic fiction. And Martin, the son, started writing in the 1970s and 80s, and he's one of the important postmodern writers, one of the proponents of postmodernism. And the reason why I wanted to talk to you about him, type down the spelling of this writer. You've got the name on my slide, the yellow book here, Martin Amis. Okay, and I just gave, it's the cover of one of his books. All right, so Martin Amis, and the father's name, which is not as important. I just want to give you some context. The father's name is Kingsley Amis. Okay, realistic fiction. Oh yeah, it's at the bottom there. Martin Amis. And Martin Amis, I chose this book because it is a good illustration of the point that I'm making here about the interconnection and about literature either precedes or explains the phenomena of our world. Time's Arrow is a very interesting novel. If if you want to read it, I'm sure that you'll be very interested, because the narrator, there's as I said, postmodernism. So they question the idea of realism, the question of the fact that things have to happen chronologically. We have to have access to the character's psychology. They're not a mystery to us. The fact that everything is knowable, everything happens. The narrator is transparent. You don't see the narrator, but what happens through the eyes of this narrator. All the postulate, all the component elements, definition of realism. Postmodern writers question that, and they question that by fiddling with chronology, and they question that by fiddling with our idea of what a novel should be, with the expected set roles of who the narrator is, who the character is, who the reader is, and they sort of blur the connections between those things by having, for example, the author interrupt the narrative by saying, "Oh, I'm the author, here I am, and this is what I think about the fictional universe," that kind of thing. So Martin Amis, a postmodern writer, he writes Time's Arrow, in which there's a problem with chronology and there's a problem with who the narrator is. And the interesting thing is that it is all about the Second World War, but we don't get to understand this before not the end of the novel, but at least the middle of the novel, because the narrator in this story is an entity who lives inside a man named Todd Friendly, as in a friend, Friendly. And the narrator cannot, the interesting thing about this narrator, because he's not an actual character, as in Kingsley Amis's novels, for example, as in Charles Dickens's novel, where, Oliver Twist tells his own story, because the narrator in Time's Arrow is not a character, he's an entity, he's sitting inside a character. He cannot control anything. He cannot control what the character Todd, what Todd does or say in any way, and he can only see Todd's life happening. And the interesting thing is that, and the reader doesn't get to understand this until some pages, some chapters into the book. What happens is that the life that is told, Todd's life, instead of progressing, normally I would be tempted to say from birth to death, progresses backwards. That's why it's called Time's Arrow, by the way, because it's going backwards, progressing backwards from death to birth. So the narrator comes to consciousness with Todd's death, and then he learns to translate, because it's told in reverse speech. The story is told in reverse speech, but very quickly the narrator learns to translate this into something that we can understand. That's kind of speech that we use. And of course, it's very confusing for the narrator and for us, because he sees things occurring backwards. He sees Todd getting stronger, more virile as he recovers. He grows noticeably younger, and then he moves back in time to a time when the character was in New York. He changes his name. He's a doctor. He goes to Portugal, changes his name, travels to Europe, Italy, and finally back to the beginning, which is back to Germany, where his name is Odilo Unverdoben. Don't remember that, but he's a doctor who works at Auschwitz, where the narrator sees the work that is being performed by this doctor as magical, because he's bringing thousands of people back to life. Remember, this is being played backwards. Okay, so he's bringing thousands of dead people back to life, and he works closely with other characters, and he doesn't, and his wife doesn't approve of his work, which is all very confusing, because it's bringing people back to life, but his wife doesn't approve. So anyway, you get this. It's a very interesting testimony of uh, of um, of that. And I'm just reading Faustin's comment. The curious case of Benjamin Button. Yeah, that's right. Same kind of narrative. So you get a whole host of narratives who do that for you. So Second World War, traumatic, host of fictions that take a specific, bring you a specific outlook on those ideas. And of course, in the history of England, I couldn't give you examples without mentioning this period. Not that the other periods are not important, but the Elizabethan period, very important, very important. The Virgin Queen, who's renowned for her cruelty. She killed her cousin, the Queen of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, among other deeds that she performed. And it's also a very important period, because it's a period when not that the theatre was born, because you'll see that it was born a long time before that, but it's the era of the theatre. It's the era in which William Shakespeare, but also his contemporaries, Christopher Marlowe, Sir Edmund Spenser, were talking about things. They were talking about the monarchy, but they couldn't talk about Queen Elizabeth, because they would have been beheaded or put into jail, or put in a London Tower. So what Shakespeare in particular, but other writers did too, what Shakespeare did was that he started writing about Roman history, or about the Plantagenets, who were uh, um, a dynasty, which was in the Middle Ages. So he started talking about the Plantagenets or Roman history, while all the while talking about things that could be understood. Richard III, that's right, Richard II, very important as well, longest reigning king in the Plantagenet king. but Richard III as well, most certainly, Claire. So he talked about those, while all the while he was talking about the historical period that he was living in, with the Elizabethan period. And next, I think it's next week, Mary Stuart by Friedrich Schiller is really good in German. You know what? I haven't read that, Claudia. I should. I think I should. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so what I was saying is that I suppose so, because I couldn't possibly read it in German, I'm afraid. Yeah, okay, I'll look it up. Yeah, Plantagenets, Richard. So when we get to this period, which is either next week or the week after, we'll be looking. I'll give you an extract from Richard II, played by Shakespeare, and we'll look at the way that patriotism is expressed, which was a time in the history of the, in the history of England, when patriotism was a really important value. So you see how the connections are made. And to finish off, I just wanted to mention the turn of the 19th century, because it's a period that I think you've heard of, and it's a period when a lot was happening in literature. Of course, it is most famous for its fin de siècle feeling, which is expressed by a dandyism. Oscar Wilde, most famously, who was jailed for his position on homosexuality. He was, of course, as you know, homosexual himself, and he was jailed for it. It's also a period which expressed all the uncertainties of the fin de siècle, of the end of the century. And in this context, a whole genre developed. It was born a little before that, but a whole genre developed, the most important or most famous of which are there on my slide, which is the genre of Gothic literature. A literature, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, a literature of darkness, a literature of fear, which expressed the fear of the period. Again, you weren't around at the turn of the other century, at the turn of the 20th century, I wouldn't say, or you were so young that you can't remember it. But there were fin de siècle anxieties, which took a very different aspect from what happened at the turn of the 19th century, for obvious reasons. But there was this fear that there was going to be an electronic bug, and that all of our data were going to be lost, financial, strategic, military data that would be lost, and there was going to be chaos, and there were people who started preparing, living in caves and preparing their dens, and it was incredible. So this return to a dark age is very frequent at the end of a century, and it's very much present in the literature of the period. Other things which well, I don't have time to go into this, but I just want to mention it quickly. Intertextuality is very important. Literature feeds off itself, and it feeds off the other books that have been published, as you know. And maybe two things that are really important when you study literature, especially, I would say, British, English language literature, because it's not just British or English or Scottish, but it applies to American literature as well. It's applied to all the literature that is written in English, basically. The Bible is one of the most important intertexts to literature. So basically what I'm saying to you here is that you need to know your Bible a little bit. I'm not asking you to read it from cover to cover, but you need to be able to recognize a certain number of things. And talking of this, the Bible is intertext. So this was just an example of how the Bible was so important in Voltaire, for example, which but I don't have time for this. But I would like to mention the Bible as intertext in British literature. We're going to come to this, as I said to you, from the Middle Ages onwards. In the Middle Ages, what was really important was our relationship to God. So, of course, the Bible is really important. Scenes from the Bible, were present in painting as well as in literature, in the kind of plays that were being put up, performed. They were called mystery plays. I'm coming to this in a minute. But just as intertext, there's an important book which I'd like you to, if not to read, at least to be aware of. It's not there. No. So I'm just giving you on this slide. I'm just giving you. Yes, it is there. The I don't know if you can see me, but this is what I'm drawing your attention to. A book by the American critic Northrop Frye. As you can see, it's quite an old book. It was published in 1982, but I just wanted, it's a book of criticism, and it's called The Great Code, the Bible and Literature. And the reason I wanted to mention this book is that this important critical milestone shows how reinstates the widely held romantic view that I was talking to you about at the beginning of this lecture, that literature is a continuation of myth making. This is a critical idea that was expressed in Northrop Frye, which will be challenged later on. But the idea is that literature is a continuation of myth making, and that the Bible constitutes the mythological universe, the supreme super text, the text that contains all texts, the supreme super texts of Western civilization. And Fry takes examples about, for example, the example of the creation in Genesis, the flood, and Noah's Ark, the idea of revolution, which is, as he explains, codified in Exodus, a resurfacing, the Christ passion in the New Testament, he makes more specific references to the story of Job, the wealthy man who's called onto an area with his extended family, and that he was blameless, upright, really a moral man, and God brags to Satan about Job's virtue, and Satan challenges God. He says, well, Job is so good because he has no, basically, I'm just saying this really quickly, he has no problems in life. But if you make him face a really hard and difficult life, then he's not going to be as virtuous as you think he is. So God challenges Satan to that, and he puts Job into a horrific situation, and Job still believes in God, basically. So we can see him, the image of Job sitting, moving from wealth and happiness to destitution and poverty and terrible state of mind, sitting on a heap of rubbish, scratching at scars because he's sick and ill, and still believing in God. So basically, this is the plot. The reason why I'm telling you about the story of Job is that this story is one of the story which gave rise, or were present in the background of some of the most famous books. Milton's Paradise Lost, is based on this idea. Obviously, Paradise Lost is based on the story. Dante, the Italian writer, the Divine Comedy is based on the storyline as well. So, all of those examples taken from various periods in the history of the world to tell you that yes, there is a connection. Yes, we need to be looking at this connection. Sometimes it's an intertextual connection. Sometimes it's just a connection in the sense that, as I said, literature foregrounds, foreshadows, or explains, or diversifies some of the things that happen. One thing that comes to my mind as I'm talking, the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood, who was awarded a Nobel Prize, was saying something along the lines of, it's not an exact quotation, but she was saying something about, because she writes dystopian, as you know, dystopian stories. Maybe you've seen or read the story with the Handmaid's Tale, which was serialized. And she says about that, about her writing, generally speaking, she says, well, the thing about fiction is that you can experiment. You can experiment with things that could happen in real life. And for that, it's priceless. So, fiction, literature in general, not just fiction, but literature in general is also that. And it's very important. It enables us to experiment, try out new things, new idea, and see where they take us. You know, if you, in the case of this, the Handmaid's Tale, it takes us to a place that nobody wants to go to. And you know, sometimes when you look at the state of the world today, what happened, you know, always is, I know that it's easy, but you know, I'm always taking Donald Trump as an example and the latest development at the Capitol. Terrible, terrible. We should experiment this in, you know, fiction and not reality. So anyway, this is what Atwood said. It enables you to experiment about the world. She uses a passage from Genesis in that. This she does. Absolutely, she does. Because as I said, the you're right. The Bible is really, really important. And the challenge for you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the challenge for you is that you're not really conversant with the Bible. You don't, you know, it's a kind of culture that was there, not even in my lifetime, but you know, my grandparents. So for you, it would be your great grandparents. But we have to remember that. We have to remember that the Bible is a really important intertext to every literary work. Okay, so how much time have I got left? 7 minutes. Okay. So in the 7 minutes that I've got left, I'm going to talk to you very briefly about how literature was born in what we call Old English literature, and it's called Old English literature because it was written. Because you know that languages have evolved. You probably have a history of languages course as well, because it's a very interesting the way that languages have, you know, changed and evolved over the years. So Old English, a very first version of what, you know, what we have identified as English. So it takes us back. Basically, if I want to look at the way that literature was born, I've got to take you back to the, and I'll do this very briefly, I promise, to the 5th and 6th century, and the 5th and 6th century conquests, because the peoples, les peuples, the peoples that were in Britain were, and I wrote it down at the top of my slide there, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And in the late 6th century, there was a process of Christianization that went on in Britain with those new people. And by the end of the 7th century, all the kingdom of Anglo-Saxon England had accepted Roman Christianity. So this, the reason why I wanted to start there, because this is a period where we moved from a pre-Christian era to a civilization, to a kingdoms, because there was more than one which had accepted Christianity. In this context, the highest achievement of Old English literature and the earliest European work of literature, if I may use this anachronism, is Beowulf. Beowulf is an epic poem, a pre-Christian composition, which was tampered with by monastic scribes who made it acceptable to people. It was later reframed to fit in with the Christian frame of reference. But anyway, it deals with events of the early 6th century, and it is believed to have been composed between 700 and 750. So, you know, oldest trace of literature in Old English. Interestingly, this is not an English story. You remember what I said to you about Scotland? The first trace of literature in Scotland was actually Welsh. It came from the Carnarvon. Well, the first trace of English literature wasn't actually English. You know, those stories traveled, and Beowulf is Scandinavian, as is testified by the names of the characters who are presented to you at the bottom of my slide there. King, and I have to apologize for my pronunciations because I'm not at all sure how it's pronounced, but King's Hrothgar or something, and who's the king of that kingdom at the time. And although it was originally untitled, but then it became titled after the Scandinavian hero whose great feats are presented in this book. because I'm running out of time, I've got 3 minutes left. I'm not going to bore you with the details of what happens in Beowulf, although it's quite interesting. But it takes place in Denmark, like Hamlet. It takes place in Denmark, where the situation is that the king of Denmark is faced with a terrible problem in the shape of a monster, an evil monster called Grendel, who attacks and kills and devours the king's warriors, the king's soldiers. And this young hero, young Beowulf, is a prince of somewhere in Sweden, and he arrives with a small band of retainers, and he says to the king that he's going to capture and kill the monster, which after a certain number of things happening in the castle, he does. He cuts off the monster's head and brings it back to the king. So, lots of festivities. He's a true hero. And actually, this whole epic poem is about the character of a true hero. What is a true hero? As Beowulf, and it sets up a tradition, the tradition of heroic poetry or epic poetry as it came to be known. And the anonymous narrator, poet narrator, recognizes that the story is pagan, it's imbued with paganism, and that the characters hold to a pagan or a pre-Christian, if you like, worldview. But he's aware that this concept of heroism can be compatible with moral values. So Beowulf's refers back to the age of monsters, to Scandinavia, to that kind of story. It's the origin of literature is in fact the origin of what happened at the origins of the world. Warfare, celebrating the achievement of heroes. And then when we skip a few centuries and we move on to the period that we'll be looking at very briefly, because I want to go on to the Elizabethan period. So the period that we'll be looking at very briefly next week, the Middle Ages, when this notion of heroism is matched with another notion that's going to be very important, the stories that are told in the Bible and the stories about God, stories of God. So this is, the origin of drama, the origin of the theatre. So I'll be talking to you about that next week. But we'll be constant, as I said, we'll be concentrating on the next period, which is the Elizabethan. I'm just going to skip from the Middle Ages to the Elizabethan period next week. So we'll do those two periods. Okay, was that clear enough for you today? What we're going to do, how we're going to set about doing this, and why I want to focus on connections all the time. Was it clear for you? So I'll try to do that. Okay, and next week I'll be looking at the Middle Ages, and then the week after we'll start looking at texts. Okay, so with an extract from Richard II. All right. For now, thank you very much for your attention, and good, perfect. Okay, and I'll see you. Have a nice day, and I'll see you again next week. And you know what? Maybe I'll see you at the university. Hopefully. Please go slower. Ooh,